She arrived for her groom. He saw her skin color and turned away. But a millionaire was already watching. What happens when a black woman reclaims land stolen from her family a century ago? When the town tries to push her out, she builds a center that changes everything. What happened next silenced the courtroom and made the entire town take notice. Riverbrook, Tennessee, a town where history didn't just whisper, it shouted in rusted bolts and the flaking paint of forgotten storefronts. The train station looked like a place where time had packed up and left long ago, fed up with waiting for progress. The wooden benches were sun-bleached to the color of ash, and the musty smell of mold crept into your nostrils and stuck to your skin like shame. Nothing moved fast here, and they sure weren't expecting someone like her. Amara Wilson stepped down from the train like every footfall was a statement. Her white lace dress, pressed until it could pass for elegance, was bought on clearance from a second-hand shop in Southside Chicago. Her hat had a delicate veil, nothing too fancy, just a soft nod to the kind of dignity her grandmother used to wear to Sunday service. Amara believed in first impressions, not because she cared what people thought, but because she knew the currency of presence. And here in a place like this, a black woman in a bridal dress was a statement folks weren't ready for. She stood there on the platform with her suitcase beside her, a vintage piece with one busted wheel and a zipper that acted temperamental when it was humid. Inside it, besides two dresses, a folder of documents, and a photo of her mother, was the only thing she truly carried. Hope, heavy, worn down, and already bruised. The train hissed and pulled away, dragging with it the last of the modern world. Amara was alone now? Almost. There he was, Harold Pierce, standing 20 feet away, looking like he'd seen a ghost that owed him money. His gut pushed out under his belt, his shoulders slouched like bad habits, and the hair on his head, what was left of it, looked like it gave up trying to hold on. He squinted. You're her? His voice was brittle, the kind of fragile that cracked when pressed. You're Amara. That's right, she said, steady and composed. Pleasure to finally meet you, Mr. Pierce. He took a half step back, as if she smelled of dynamite and deliverance. You didn't say, you never mentioned that I'm black? Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried history. He stammered, glancing around as if someone might save him from the truth standing in front of him. It's just, I've got a business, a reputation. People won't understand. You know how it is. She folded her arms slowly, her eyes narrowing just enough to draw blood. Funny, you wrote about loneliness, about how you didn't care about appearances, just soul. You remember that word, Harold? Soul? He looked down at the ground like it might swallow him. Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather. Folks didn't have much to do in Riverbrook, but nobody passed up free theater, especially not a scene like this. White man in Sunday clothes backing away from a black woman in a wedding dress. It was scandal wrapped in tulle. I'll pay for your ticket back, he blurted out, desperation leaking from every syllable. I'll cover a few nights in a motel. No harm, no foul. We can just forget this. And what exactly am I supposed to forget? She asked. That I came all this way because a man told me he wanted real companionship? That you talked about building a life, but couldn't even face the mirror long enough to admit you still live by the rules of 1954? He pulled a wad of bills from his pocket, crumpled 20s and 10s, sweat slick and shaking. Amara didn't reach for them. She didn't even blink. These are the same hands that mailed me roses, the same fingers that wrote those long letters about your dreams. And now, you're trying to buy your way out of the truth. That's not just sad, Harold. That's pathetic. She turned to leave. Her pride was still intact, but barely. Her heart, a little less so. She'd take her suitcase, walk back into whatever town would have her, and bury this day under a pile of shame she didn't earn. That was the plan until he showed up. A voice rang out, deep and commanding, like a bass drum in a cathedral. So that's your choice, Pierce? Try to pay her off? Just like you pay your taxes late and your workers less? You really are consistent. The voice belonged to a man in a tailored navy suit, crisp white shirt, and shoes that shined like they'd never touched gravel. Alexander Maxwell, local landowner, real estate developer, political donor, man whose handshake could get a street paved or a mayor re-elected. He wasn't looking at Harold. He was looking at Amara with a kind of reverence that said, I see you. This doesn't concern you, Maxwell, Harold muttered, voice cracking like old vinyl. See? That's where you're wrong, Alexander replied. When I see a man dragging a woman's dignity through the mud, it becomes everybody's business. Miss Wilson, allow me to introduce myself. Alexander Maxwell. I own a property a few miles out. If you'd allow, I'd be honored to offer you a room and a hot meal. My housekeeper makes a roast that'll change your religion." Amara eyed him, not with suspicion, but with the careful precision of a woman who had seen too many wolves dressed like pastors. But something in his tone, calm, unwavering, and utterly without pity, rang true. She nodded. "I accept." As she took his arm and walked away, Harold stood frozen. The money slipped from his fingers and fluttered across the platform like confessions in a storm. No one helped him pick it up. The onlookers moved aside like the Red Sea, parting for something they didn't fully understand, but knew better than to block. If Maxwell had claimed her publicly, then she wasn't a stranger. She was under protection, and Riverbrook knew exactly what that meant. The carriage ride was silent at first. Amara kept her eyes on the road, the vineyards rolling by, the sunset dusting the hills like sugar on sorrow. "You carry yourself with more dignity than most men I've known," Alexander finally said. "And I get the feeling you didn't just arrive here. You returned." She turned toward the window again. Maybe he was right. But whether it was fate or failure that brought her here, this town was about to learn. You can't keep bearing the truth and expect it not to grow roots. Alexander Maxwell was a man of old-school sensibilities. In Riverbrook, his last name carried more weight than the mayor's seal in City Hall, if there even was a mayor, and even more than the thick-set wreaths of magnolias draping over cracked sidewalks. But like any person born on the right side of privilege, he mastered the art of holding his tongue, knowing precisely when to pause, when to speak, and most importantly, when to provide unspoken protection. Now standing with Amara on the threshold of his sprawling estate, all he offered was a single, steady promise. "Nobody owes you a thing," he said calmly, eyes holding hers, steady as granite. "But in this place, and you will be safe. That's enough, for now." Blue Room, he called it, a pristine guest room that dwarfed the worn apartment she left behind in Southside Chicago. Its window framed the sprawling vineyards beyond, vines heavy with promise, lit by the soft pink of dawn. On the nightstand sat a crystal glass of water and neatly folded towels, almost reverent in their arrangement. Everything spoke of old-world hospitality, too clean, too polished, an apology to a world that turned its back on her for too long. But the town of Riverbrook, it didn't stay quiet. It began whispering, and those whispers filled the air with poison. The grocery store scene. The very next morning, Amara stepped into the local grocery, only needing bread, milk, and maybe a sliver of neighborly politeness. What she got instead was a barrage of cold stares. The teenage cashier, eyes narrow like she just spotted a roach scurrying across her register, raised a broadcast mic and leaned in. "We've got a customer. Special one. Take your time, Jenny. Ain't nobody rushing." She never got that bread. The line behind her thinned, and folks just retreated, as though proximity to her was contamination, her skin a silent crime in their world. No one said a word, but every suppressed breath told her what they thought. "Go back. You don't belong here." The library cold shoulder. Day 3 found her at the library, hoping to find a quiet place to sort thoughts and maybe check out a book or two. The librarian, a prim white woman with pursed lips, locked eyes with Amara and said almost sweetly, "Oh, sweetie, our system it's down today. And you know, we can't check out books without proper registration. And your stay is just temporary, right?" The tone was sickly sweet, like honey mixed with venom, because the town knew who she was now, and forgiveness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Amara didn't want revenge. What she craved was peace, or at least a corner where nobody could tell her how much she was worth. But peace in a white town meant folding yourself flat, and she wasn't made for folding. While they whispered and conspired, watching her every move, their silent resistance evolved into open intimidation, confrontation at the gate. On the 5th day, Amara returned from wandering the estate grounds when she heard shouting by the gates. 3 men, a snapshot straight out of a Saturday night small-town special, stood in her path. They smelled of cheap beer and entitlement. "Hey, miss," one drawled, voice coarse as gravel. "You lost?" She kept walking, holding her head high, voice even. "No, I'm not lost. I'm just not in hell yet. But I appreciate the hospitality." They snorted, smirking with the confidence of predators in familiar territory. "Don't get smart," said the second, sneering. "This isn't Chicago. We keep order around here." She paused mid-step, turning to face them, eyes blazing. "And apparently you keep cowardice too. And I see you're doing a fine job." The third man spat on the ground, lunging forward with false bravado. "You're lucky Maxwell's house isn't hearing this. But trust, We got ways to make you regretting sticking around. That was the last straw for many. They aimed their racism like a weapon, and Riverbrook had given it its loudest megaphone yet. Go back, in red paint. Dawn couldn't come soon enough, but when she opened her curtains, the gate was slashed wide in red paint. Go back, bold, thick, no apologies. Because hate rarely bothers with commas, and spelling errors are for amateurs. Maxwell arrived seconds later, coat unbuttoned, hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't ask or warn her first, he just surveyed the vandalism. He drew a long breath and turned to her, voice low but precise. They thought fear would make you leave. He paused. You know what's always astonished me, Amara? The folks most terrified of a shifting demographic. They lack the very soul they're so frantic to preserve. Who are they replacing? Who's next? He offered her protection, security, nearly every luxury he could imagine, but she refused. Let them watch, she said, eyes hard as flint. Let them stare. I'm done hiding. I'm done feeling like my skin makes me criminal. They thought silence could chase her away, but her voice was just waking up. The council meeting behind closed doors. That evening, in a stately conference room with walls thick enough to swallow secrets, local leaders, none of whom had the courage to say her name out loud, gathered for a closed-door meeting. Harold Pierce, sweating like guilt itself, pounded his notes. She's destabilizing our community, he barked from the head of the table. She's not just a guest, she's a threat. I heard she's rummaging through archives, digging for incriminating papers. She's not a visitor. She's a revolution wearing a lace hat. A snide interjection came from the back row. Maxwell's lost his mind. What's next? He'll open a school. For color folks? Laughs, half cruel, half terrified, filled the room. If she stays, they'll send journalists, auditors, lawyers. We can't have that. And in that moment, they decided it was time to act. Not as men of principle, but as frightened people with too much to lose. Amara in the archives. Meanwhile, under the dim lamplight of the library's basement, Amara sat hunched over century-old ledgers and faded deeds. In her lap lay her battered suitcase, the lining carefully tailored to conceal a legacy. Inside, legal deeds, tax documents, notarized title transfers, all in the name of her grandfather, John Wilson, once a houseman and, by blood and law, rightful landowner. This land, she whispered, tracing lines on a yellowed map. They never bought it. They took it, hidden behind legalese, sealed with company logos made for controlling people, not justice. Her eyes flicked up at the window, breathing in the dust motes dancing in the fading sun. She felt whole, a part of centuries of stolen dignity. And in her chest, anger glowed bright, sharp, righteous, unyielding. Anger that knew how to drive change. We'll meet again, she murmured, in the council agenda, this time on equal ground. The Riverbrook Council Chamber wasn't designed for justice. It was built for comfort. Comfort of the few, comfort of the familiar, comfort of power behind polished oak and expensive cologne. The walls were paneled in deep, glossy wood, oak so old it remembered the hands that once picked the trees and probably didn't get paid for it. Framed portraits of every mayor since 1854 loomed from above, every last one of them a white man with the same stony expression that said, I built this town for people like me. The air inside carried the scent of old cigars, masculine sweat, and something more pungent, fear. The kind of fear that comes when the ghosts you buried start showing up in daylight. And on this particular morning, one of those ghosts walked right through the door, dressed not in chains or shadows, but in authority. Amara Wilson entered at 9:59 a.m. sharp. She didn't wait for a cue or a welcome. She didn't need one. She stepped into the chamber like she owned the hour, and in some ways, she did. In her hands was a plain black folder, no designer label, no shiny clasp, but inside that folder was enough firepower to shift the entire foundation of Riverbrook, enough to make Harold Pierce's throat tighten like a man choking on his own legacy. Behind her walked Alexander Maxwell, not as a shield, not as a mouthpiece, but as a witness. He knew whose moment this was. His presence wasn't to guide, it was to honor. The room murmured instantly, what is she doing here? She doesn't belong here. This is a private meeting. The chorus of discomfort rose fast and brittle, like glassware under pressure. But Amara didn't flinch. Instead, she raised her eyes, steady, sharp, and unapologetically black, and let her voice slice through the noise like a conductor with a baton. According to Riverbrook Municipal Charter, any landowner within a 10-mile radius has the legal right to attend open deliberations pertaining to their property, As of tomorrow, that property includes land I now lawfully possess. So yes, this is very much my business. You may continue." Dead silence followed, like the room had never heard a woman, let alone a black woman, speak the law like scripture. She walked forward and placed her folder directly on the council table. No flourish, just finality. A rustle of papers followed, then whispers, urgent, unsettled. "That's a notarized signature. 1912, this can't be. This is a will. It's legitimate. It's his land." And then Harold Pierce exploded like a man who just realized the walls were closing in. "This is forgery," he barked, lurching to his feet. His face was a storm of red, like shame and fury were boiling in his blood. "This is fraud. Fabricated nonsense. This is a scam." Amara turned slowly, fixing her eyes on him the way you study a snake in tall grass. "Oh, Harold, darling, I understand you're used to being audited only for your cholesterol. But today, we're going to examine something far more serious. Your ethics." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Eyes widened. Harold turned, desperate, to the head of the council, an older man with decades of silence behind his eyes. "Say something. You can't let this stand. You know what this will do to us. To everything." The councilman glanced down at the folder again, the weight of its truth dragging at his shoulders. "If the documents are valid," he said slowly, "we have no grounds to object. The law is the law." "The law?" Pierce Street. "We know who the law was written for, and it damn sure wasn't written for her." Then Maxwell stood, quietly, calmly. But when he spoke, the room froze. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. You've just said aloud what this entire town's been whispering for the last century. We'll be sure to include your words in the official minutes." Silence so thick it hummed. This wasn't just Amara's victory. This was revelation, exposure, sunlight pouring into a room built to keep the dark truths hidden. In the corner, a clap rang out, then another. Not from town officials, not from the ones whose names were on bank buildings or gravestones, but from the observers, the law students, the journalists, the young activists who had come expecting theater and witness transformation. Pierce didn't wait for the gavel. He grabbed his coat like a man escaping a fire and stormed out of the room, his name trailing behind him like a crumpled flyer no one wanted anymore. That evening, the faded sign reading, "Pierce and Sons Agricultural Supply," vanished from Main Street, gone, as though the town itself had decided to forget. Back at the Maxwell estate, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the vineyard. The air smelled of crushed grapes and something far older, like memory fermenting into meaning. Maxwell poured 2 glasses of iced tea and joined Amara on the veranda. "You do understand," he said, voice soft. "You didn't just win a legal claim. You cracked the earth wide open. Folks will be telling this story for decades." Amara didn't smile. She didn't lift her glass. "I'm tired," she said. "Tired of being someone people make exceptions for. Tired of always proving I deserve what others are just given. I'm not an exception. I'm the rule they keep erasing." He nodded. "So what now?" he asked. She looked out across the land. The same land her grandfather once walked, broom in hand, dignity in every step, ownership in none. She glanced down at the faded maps, at the documents that now had weight. "I build," she said. "I build a center. For education, for legal literacy, in my grandfather's name. For all the people who never got justice. For those who were made to believe that the color of their skin was some sort of miscalculation in history's math." 3 days later, the local paper ran a front-page story. "A woman from the past reclaims her land and her name. Town in shock." But Amara, she wasn't in shock. She was in motion. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. A week passed, then another. And in Riverbrook, silence returned, but not the kind people were used to. This wasn't the soft silence of submission, of people keeping their heads down and their mouths shut to survive another day under the illusion of peace. No, this silence was new, heavy, unsettling, the kind that clings to the edges of change and waits to see which way history will turn. Some held their breath out of fear, others out of admiration, and many just out of pure disbelief. And Amara, she didn't retreat, didn't flinch. She walked the same streets where people once turned their backs. She stepped into the same shops where silence used to greet her like a slap. But now things were different. Heads nodded, eyes met hers. Not with apology, not yet, but with recognition. "We saw," those nods said. "We know." And that was enough. For now. But Amara didn't come to town for acknowledgement. She didn't live for silent nods or half-swallowed shame. She lived for purpose. and purpose doesn't wait for comfort. On the third week, on the very piece of land Pierce once treated like his personal gold mine, change took root. Construction began, not with slick corporate contractors or city trucks shipped in from the capital. These were local workers. Same folks who once wouldn't look her in the eye now stood hammering, laying stone, mixing concrete with calloused hands and new understanding. They built a modest structure, one story, big windows, clean light, no fences, no marble, no monuments. Just a building with a foundation sturdy enough to carry a legacy. The sign had already been ordered weeks earlier, waiting in storage like a promise. John Wilson's Center for Education and Legal Memory. When Marshall, the carpenter, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and hands that had built half the town, asked, "Why memory? Ain't this for the future?" Amara didn't hesitate. "There is no future without memory," she said. "Our people have lived too long with our past erased. This isn't just about teaching law. It's about teaching that we belong to it, that we have a right to it." Marshall stared for a second, then nodded, slow, heavy, like a man realizing, after years of doing things out of routine, he was finally building something with meaning. But the system, it never dies quietly. Pierce, as expected, struck back the only way he knew how: paperwork. He filed a lawsuit so thick with legal jargon, you'd need a forklift to carry the hypocrisy. Tenants' rights violation, property fraud, moral damages. Oh, the irony. Pierce, who spent 30 years reaping profits from stolen land, now clutched his pearls and called for justice, like a man who suddenly found religion. The ink on the complaint wasn't even dry before he started spinning interviews with anyone who'd listen. Maxwell offered his top legal team. He had the best, national names. But Amara gently declined. "Thank you," she said. "But if I don't bring people like me into this fight, then I've already lost, even if I win." And she found him, Jason Banks, young, black, brilliant, a graduate of the Equal Law Initiative, his degree earned through grit, night jobs, and the kind of brilliance that doesn't come from privilege, but from hunger. He didn't want a retainer. He wanted the truth. On the day of the hearing, he arrived in a slate gray suit that caught light just enough to whisper confidence. Some scoffed. One of Pierce's seasoned lawyers chuckled into his colleague's ear. "Looks like the intern's here to play attorney." But then Jason opened his mouth. 10 minutes in, and the courtroom turned quiet as a church before a thunderstorm. Jason didn't perform. He educated. Calm, steady, relentless. He laid down precedents like bricks, explained the validity of the deeds, cited tax records, legal transfers, and council codes. He walked the judge, step by step, through 100 years of truth buried beneath 50 years of denial. And when he finished, he didn't close with a flourish. He closed with truth. If the law exists only to protect what's already been taken and not to restore what was stolen, then it's not justice. It's a shield for theft. If this court denies the legitimacy of a black family's rightful claim, not because the paperwork is false, but because their skin and surname weren't expected to win, then what does that make this courtroom? The judge, white, in her 50s, former colleague of Maxwell's, sat still for a long time. You could hear hearts thumping against ribs. Then she finally spoke. "This court recognizes the legitimacy of the ownership documents presented by Amara Wilson. The plaintiff's complaint is dismissed. Case closed." There it was. No bells, no fireworks, just justice, plain and final. The town felt it like a door slamming shut. It was done. Not paused, not debated. Done. Amara didn't celebrate, didn't post photos. No live stream, no interviews. She went home, sat on the front steps of her house, and stared at the land. Not like a victor, but like a steward, because it never belonged to her alone. It belonged to memory, and now that memory had a home. That night, she posted one message to her old community page. No hashtags, no filters. "We're not asking, we're reclaiming, we're building, because waiting is not a strategy, it's a trap." 2 weeks later, the center opened. No ribbon cutting, no media, just 14 people, a chalkboard with her grandfather's name in bold, and children, real ones, curious, nervous, wide-eyed. Then it happened. An elderly white woman approached, frail, leaning on a cane, voice trembling. "My grandson, he's 12. He can't read. We've been too ashamed to ask for help, but can he come here?" Amara didn't flinch, didn't blink. She looked that woman in the eye, not with pity, with resolve. This center is for him. That moment, it didn't need press coverage. It didn't need applause, because something real had shifted. The town was still divided, but the silence, it changed color. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was processing. Lies no longer held the monopoly on narrative. And Amara? That night she locked the door to the center, took one long look at the field that once grew nothing but someone else's profit, and whispered more to the land than to herself, "We're back, and this time, you can't erase us."